good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the Autumn 2017 UW Tech Policy Lab Distinguished Lecture. My name is Batya Friedman. I'm one of the co-directors of the lab, and Ryan Callow is one of our other co-directors from the law school. We're really pleased to invite you all here this evening to hear a lecture from James Sussman. The way this lecture came about is, and I don't always do this, but I was reading the New York Times, and there was this very short interview with this fellow named James Sussman. The interviewer asked him 5 questions. So I read the questions and I read the answers, and I thought, gee, that's a person I would really like to hear how they think things through. And there was a teaser in there, too, because while he was talking about his experience living with hunter-gatherers in the San, the Bushman people, he was also having his eye on the future and the future of modern or Western society. And so that also captured my imagination. So James, I learned this evening, actually was born in South Africa. Then he, immigrated to where the Brits are for a while. He got his PhD in Scotland, and along the way, prior to that, he actually went back to Africa and began studying and spending time with and living with the Bushmen and various other indigenous peoples in that area. The book he's recently published, and the reason there was an interview in the New York Times, is Affluence Without Abundance. And so you can see in that title, he's asking the question about how we can experience as human beings a sense of affluence without needing lots of stuff. To introduce James to you, I thought it would be interesting to read something from Tim Ingold's book called Making: Anthropology, Archaeology, Art, and Architecture. When I read this just the other day, I thought, this is what James is really about. So Ingold writes, as anthropologists, we currently find ourselves in a double bind. How can we do justice to the ethnographic richness and complexity of other cultures while simultaneously opening up to radical speculative inquiry into the potentials of human life? The alternatives seem to lie between abdicating from our responsibility to engage in critical dialogue around the great questions of how to fashion our collective humanity in a world that is teetering on the edge of catastrophe, or turning the people among whom we have worked into unwitting mouthpieces for philosophies of salvation that are not of their own making. Neither alternative has served anthropology well. The first leaves the discipline on the margins, condemned to the retrospective documentation of indigenous worlds that seem always to be on the brink of disappearing. The second only fuels the popular belief that the traditional wisdom of native people can somehow rescue the planet. And so what Ingold then says is, on the contrary, to be free to bring ways of knowing and feeling shaped through transformational engagements with people from around the world, both within and beyond the settings of fieldwork, to the essentially prospective work, prospective task of helping to find a way into a future common to us all. And when I read how James spoke about his work and his ideas about looking to a hunter-gatherer perspective and thinking about technology and then our future, I thought that he is doing the kind of thing that Tim Ingold is asking for. So with no further introduction, I welcome James. Please join me.
Batya, thank you very much for the kind, welcoming words. I have to say, when I got that first email from you inviting me to do this lecture, I was a little bit surprised and very flattered, of course, at the same time. I was kind of surprised, partially because I've never seen the words distinguished and James Sussman in the same sentence before, so it sort of took me back a little bit. I was also a little bit surprised because, well, I'm an anthropologist, and the idea of sort of being involved in tech policy is not something that I'd thought a great deal about. I mean, I know there are lots of anthropologists who work in the tech space. There's a whole new faculties of digital anthropology, where people are looking at how people interact in digital realms and in digital spaces and how it shapes our engagement with one another and the world around us. There's, of course, an entire branch of anthropology which is based with our engagement with the physical world around us, objects, tech, and how that shapes our relationships between ourselves and others as well. Regrettably, I'm not either of those kinds of anthropologist. I'm a kind of the old-fashioned kind of anthropologist, the one who likes to go out to distant places. And in my particular case, I focused on peoples who in many ways were considered to be far more representative of our human past rather than our present or our future. The reason that the indigenous people of southern Africa, the Khoisan, and in particular the Bushmen, the people that live in the Kalahari Desert, were studied so furiously, I suppose, by anthropology was because they were seen to be the best living exemplars of our hunter-gatherer ancestors by having a limited material culture and having lived in the relative isolation of the Kalahari Desert for, at the time it was thought, around 20 millennia. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about those timescales because that's what makes some of this very interesting. So in terms of sort of how this relates to some of the sort of big questions about tech policy, I did think for a moment maybe she's got the wrong guy, but then I kind of realized that actually there is one very big area and one very big focus of my book, which does actually apply very closely to tech and tech policy issues and some of the really big questions. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a couple of objects, a couple of technological objects, and I'm going to use that as a way to really articulate a kind of philosophy of technology that shaped hunter-gatherer life, and in particular shaped a particular vision of sustainability. And I wouldn't even say a vision of sustainability, a practice of sustainability. But that's something I'm going to do along the path to talking about a bigger question. And the bigger obvious question as it relates to tech policy and as it relates in particular to the main theme of my book is the challenge of automation, which seems to exercise a great many people these days. There's a huge dialogue going on about what the impact of roboticization, I don't know if that's actually a word or not, but automation, artificial intelligence, there's a whole narrative of this that instead of being this kind of Jetson-like fantasy of great convenience, there's now become a kind of fear-based narrative. And I'm not talking about Elon Musk and his sort of fantasies of a kind of Terminator-filled dystopia. I'm talking about the kind of concerns that have sort of come up again, and they've come up recently, for example, in various electoral policies, and when we're looking at the sort of forces that are changing our societies at the moment, is the implications of what is going to happen to people who work when technology takes their jobs. That is the narrative as it plays out. And that is the question that I'm most interested in, and that is the one that I think has the most obvious implications in terms of understanding how hunter-gatherers traditionally live. But that is also just emblematic. I mean, that particular question is emblematic of a broader set of philosophical issues and approaches relating to how we engage with technology and relating to how we meet some of the biggest challenges in our future. Now, the idea that technology is going to take away jobs is not, as much as it sort of seems to be the great new idea at the moment. Of course, this is something that people have worried about time and time again in the past. And I'm going to bring up a picture of somebody who worried about it in the past. I hope I pressed the right button. Yeah, this bearded fellow. Not bearded, wore us moustached. Not a hipster or anything. This is John Maynard Keynes. Who I'm going to call John Maynard Keynes because, well, he's not allowed to complain, and I just think of him as Keynes rather than Keynes because that's how it's spelled. Keynes, of course, was arguably the most influential economist of the 20th century. He was responsible for a huge amount of really the sort of more socially minded monetary and fiscal policies that shaped the 20th century, really from the Great Depression onwards. And the reason I'm invoking him in a lecture about the Kalahari, which is a place I believe he knew absolutely nothing about, in fact, I'm certain he knew nothing about it, was because in 1930, he was sitting in his office at Cambridge. He was the bursar of King's College, sitting in a very grand office, and he was sort of ruminating on all the money he'd lost in the stock market crash of 1929. He'd been pretty heavily invested, and he'd lost a whole bunch of cash. And was doubtless feeling gloomy, but he wasn't going to let things get down, and he probably had a few of the fine college ports. King still has a very good wine cellar, And their version of poverty is not really everybody else's version of poverty. But to try and cheer himself up, he wrote an essay, which sort of goes hidden in obscurity, but it actually began to come out and get circulated around 10 years ago. And in this particular essay, what he decided to do was sort of ignore the miseries of the day and take flight into the future. And the essay is entitled "The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren." And in it, what he tried to do is imagine what the economies of developed countries would look like 100 years into the future, 100 years on from 1929, which is really more or less now, 2030, 2017. So. And what he did was he made a series of calculations in this essay. And in it, he took the optimistic view that regardless of all the troubles that were afflicting the global economy at that particular time, he took the view that by the year 2030, what he called the economic problem will have been solved. And by the economic problem, he was referring to that axiom of mainstream economics, that cornerstone of most economic thinking, sometimes called the fundamental economic problem, more often referred to as the problem of scarcity. This idea that our economic activities, that we work, that we do things, that we're productive, because we are a species with infinite wants and limited means. And in this essay, he speculated that the convergence of three things. Oh, good, and they were really teeny tiny on my screen earlier this afternoon. I wasn't sure if anybody would see them. He argued that the combination between productivity improvements, capital growth, and technological advancements would, by the time of his grandchildren, result in the solution of the economic problem. And by that he meant we would reach a state where effectively scarcity did not exist in the way that it did and had done for many of the last, well, really, as far as he thought about it, really since time immemorial. He believed that what would happen is these would converge together and that we'd be in a situation where pretty much all of our basic needs, our essential needs, the things that we needed to lead a fulfilled and decent life, would be met on the basis of no more than 15 hours work per week. So it was this kind of economic utopia, and this is the language he used. He talked about it as a kind of promised land, and it's a very, he writes in a very sort of floral fashion, and I think he'd had a lot of port with this particular essay because it's probably more floral than much of his other writing. Now, in making this, Keynes had one reservation. He thought that there were, save wars, acts of God, and other unforeseeable events. He thought that the only thing that might stop humankind, and in particular he was referring to developed economies, achieving this particular utopia was what he referred to as our instinct to work, our drive to be productive. And I'll read you a little extract from the essay. And you have to imagine that I'm drunk and sitting in an armchair in King's College. And he put it this way. He said, if instead of looking into the future, we look into the past, we find that the economic problem, the struggle for subsistence, always has been hitherto the primary, most pressing problem of the human race. And not only of the human race, but of the whole biological kingdom, from the beginnings of life in its most primitive form. Thus, we have been expressly evolved by nature, with all our impulses and deepest instincts, for the purpose of solving the economic problem. And if the economic problem is solved, he continues, mankind will be deprived of its traditional purpose. Now, Keynes filled the essay with lots of sort of other fairly depressing thoughts about our inclination to work, and then a sort of rather long rant about how much he disliked purposive moneymakers, which I thought was odd because actually after the essay, when the stock markets improved again, he became quite a purposive moneymaker. But overall, he painted a fairly optimistic vision. He thought this problem of wanting to work and being purposive was something that we could overcome. And he believed that fundamentally humans were of the sort that actually when we achieve this abundance, as he referred to it, we would be able to embrace it. There'd be teething problems and that there would be some people who wouldn't be able to get on and they'd just continue to build and create. But most of us would happily embrace it and we'd all be living in this kind of 15-hour work week utopia and possibly even less. Now, the essay is an extraordinary piece of work, an extraordinary brilliant piece of work, and I think it's a bit of nitpicking from hindsight to pick criticisms with something that was as far-sighted as what he wrote. But he did get a number of things wrong. And just so that I don't get wrong what he got wrong, I'm just going to make sure I check my notes so I get them all right. The first one is fairly obvious. He got the thresholds. We passed the thresholds in terms of productivity alone by 1980 that he identified would need to be reached to achieve this economic promised land. In terms of technology, we've surpassed it beyond his wildest imaginations. He couldn't have even imagined the possibilities of the digital world and the technological advancements that have happened. And likewise, in terms of capital growth, we have long since surpassed the thresholds he identified that would need to have been met. Again, all of this was really quite a long time ago. So on that, he was very clearly and absolutely wrong. The second thing that he got wrong was thinking about technology and the way technology works. Now, he tended to think about, as people did then, technology as something that people use in service to meeting some particular needs that they're responsive to. Now, of course, we all know that with the tech boom, as it's been over the last, in particular, 15, 20 years, that, in a sense, technology has become, rather than being something that is purely in service to meeting our absolute needs, as Keynes saw it, technology has actually become a great driver of capital growth in and of itself, and actually owning technology and owning the rights over certain technologies has become a very important form of capital. The third thing Keynes got wrong, and I think this is also a fairly critical one, and it's one I'm going to double back to when I come towards the end of the lecture, is that Keynes also, and again, he can't really be blamed for not knowing something that was going to happen in the future. He had no idea of what the consequences of all this kind of growth that he envisaged in productivity would have. In that we have very clear sustainability challenges in terms of everything from climate change to various social implications, biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, all emanating from this continued drive towards economic growth. So that's another big area that he got wrong. But he did get one thing particularly wrong, and it's the only one that was really, it's the only real biggie. And this is the one that relates, again, to his overall sense that, you know, this idea of solving the economic problem was the result of thousands of generations of human ingenuity moving into the future, getting bigger and better things, sort of dragging ourselves up from the primordial muck and eventually becoming this kind of affluent modern people. And what he got wrong with that, and this sort of echoes through the whole thing and really is going to be the sort of key theme, is that he didn't realize that actually for most of human history, and human history goes back a lot further than people thought at that time. In fact, it goes back now a lot further than we even thought 20 years ago, that for most of human history, our hunting and gathering ancestors probably worked a little more than 15 hours per week in order to meet their basic needs. And that really is going to be the primary focus of what I talk about tonight and in the rest of this talk. And why is this important now? Well, it's important now because, as I've mentioned, we have these obvious sustainability challenges. We're in an era where things have changed a great deal, and old solutions clearly do not work. And as I will sort of argue a little bit later, I think a lot of the solutions that we're proposing to these problems are vested very much in this kind of mindset that emerged during the agricultural revolution and the problem of scarcity, and that we need to move beyond that to try and rethink our futures and how we imagine and engage with the world. The second reason that this is important is, in a sense, many of the things we do, we kind of ascribe to human nature. So when you look at a lot of the language of economics and a lot of the language of what people do, they say it's who we are. This is how it is to be human. And in fact, lots of the political debates all talk about what it is to be human. So in terms of sort of the narratives of, you know, in the States, in particular the narratives around socialism and so on, it's actually debates on what it means to be essentially human. And what we've learned over the last 20 years through the advent of, in particular, genomics, so this ability to actually sequence the human and read the human genomes and peel it back like an onion, it gives us an extraordinary insight into history. And what that's done is it's effectively shown us that humanity is a lot older than we thought it was. When I started off as a student in the 1990s and studying hunter-gatherers and anthropology, there was sort of speculation, people would sort of say cautiously, that hunter-gatherers, contemporary hunting and gathering populations like the Bushmen in southern Africa, might be representative of a way of life that was a human universal around 15, 20,000 years ago. There was also a sense that actually before 20,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, who'd maybe been around 30,000 years, so people thought, actually weren't particularly bright until 20,000 years ago. So people talked about a cognitive revolution where hunter-gatherers suddenly, Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens sapiens. They became really clever and started developing complex symbolic activity and building sophisticated tools and so on. We now know that this is not the case, and we know this largely through genetics. Genetics now suggests, and that I'll get to that in a bit. Genetics now suggests that humanity is possibly 150,000 years old in terms of being and acting in a very modern way. We also think the genetic evidence suggests that actually modern Homo sapiens have been around for 200,000 years. Now, this is an interesting space because the boundaries of it keep changing. So certainly when I published the book, I was talking about 200,000 years ago for Homo sapiens emergence somewhere in central southern Africa. And then really the week of publication, new news came out that actually a set of jawbones found in Morocco, which were very Homo sapiens-like, had been redated, and they'd been redated to 300,000 years old. So its potential, the scale and scope of human history is much longer. And that also suggests that our period as hunter-gatherers had a much greater impact on us in terms of evolutionary selective processes than was previously imagined. And that if we take modern hunting and gathering people as an analog, and there are debates and issues around how much we can do that, but if we take those modern hunting and gathering people as an analog, then we might be able to develop better insights into the kind of forces that have shaped certainly the way we think, the way we engage, and the way we do many different things. Now, when Keynes wrote his piece about the economic future for his grandchildren, the standard thinking at the time was that hunter-gatherers lived lives that were pretty much nasty, brutish, and short. There was this idea that somehow they spent their time running around either desperately trying to kill food and then spending the rest of their time trying to avoid being eaten by some saber-toothed cats and other things. It was viewed as a life of basically unremitting misery. And this is seen again and again when you look at sort of diary extracts and the attitudes of farming people and colonials, again to hunting and gathering peoples who they tended to view as, almost subhuman, almost verminous. And there's certainly with people in the Kalahari, there's a whole narrative, and a very complex set of narratives about positioning them as kind of like a missing link. I was told again and again and again on my fieldwork by the people that lived around Bushmen, oh no, these Bushmen, they don't think like normal people do, they're more animal-like and so on and so on. So there were all these extraordinary mythologies. It was only in the 1960s, though, that the first very serious anthropological studies of contemporary hunting and gathering populations actually revealed that hunter-gatherer life was not nearly as difficult as was assumed. And the first and most important study of its kind happened with the group of people that I ended up spending most of my working life with, the Zheng'asi, sometimes referred to as the Kong, which is usually spelled with an exclamation mark, K-U-N-G, the Klik language-speaking hunter-gatherers of the northeastern Kalahari in Namibia and Botswana, who at the time were viewed as the most isolated of the remaining Bushman peoples in southern Africa, and as a result of that, probably to be the best living exemplars of traditional hunting and gathering life. A Canadian anthropologist went out and started doing some work with these groups, and he was an organized fellow, Richard Bourchier-Lee. And he decided what he'd do is he'd look at how hard hunter-gatherers worked to make a living. After all, these people lived in a desert, a very marginal environment, and clearly this was a tough place to live. And so what he did was he set about timing the amount of time people spent gathering food, putting it together, and then measuring the calorific value of the different foods, doing a sort of fairly basic thing. It wasn't super detailed, but he could work out what was the carbohydrates and proteins and so on, and fats and all the rest. And he discovered two things. He discovered, firstly, that actually hunter-gatherers at the time, in 1960, were better nourished than the average European. Europe was coming still sort of stuttering out of the kind of post-war rationing and slow growth that happened there. So diets weren't particularly brilliant, but the hunter-gatherers that he worked with, the Zheng'asi, actually ate pretty well. What was even more surprising was that they did so on the basis of 15 to 17 hours work per week. And that applies to both genders. In fact, men worked a little bit more than women generally, but that was partially because men actually really enjoyed going hunting. So they'd often sort of stretch out a hunting trip to a couple of days because it was kind of fun. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. So they, in effect, in a sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek, another anthropologist who sort of attended the conference where Lee presented his findings and where other anthropologists like James Woodburn, who'd been working with the Hadzabe in Tanzania, and all sorts of other people presented similar findings, began to express similar thoughts based on their particular experiences. Another anthropologist who was there, a generalist, not an ethnographer, a guy called Marshall Salins, wrote an very important essay in a book called Stone Age Economics, and in it, he referred to hunter-gatherers as the original affluent society. And this was a play on the famous book by J.K. Galbraith, The Affluent Society, which had come out a few years previously. Salins, when he talked about hunter-gatherer affluence, was, however, very clear on the fact that these were societies with very limited material culture, with very few objects. They were not obviously wealthy in any way, shape, or form. They didn't have permanent houses. They were often highly mobile. And pretty much everything they owned, they could carry with them. But what Salins defined it as is he suggested that in this particular case, the economic problem, this idea that we as a species are driven by having infinite wants and limited means, he said didn't apply to hunter-gatherers quite obviously. Hunter-gatherer cultures seem to have, and he used this phrase, the Zen road to affluence. This was the 60s and it was, but he argued that the basis of hunter-gatherer affluence was by having few needs which were easily met. And that the reason why they were happy enough to spend only 15 hours a week working to achieve their needs is because they didn't have great needs at all. So there wasn't this kind of continual sense of future-focused aspiration. And so that was the basis of this whole thesis of primitive affluence, this whole idea that there's a different way of looking at the economic problem. And this is a particularly important issue now. And what I want to do in terms of understanding its evolutionary impact, I mentioned earlier about the genetic history. I think it's worth just saying why, in particular, the Bushman groups, people in the Kalahari, are so important in terms of understanding this particular idea. And that's because, in a fairly radical notion, the peoples of Southern Africa, the indigenous peoples of Southern Africa, are arguably the most successful and sustainable civilization in all of human history. And I realize I'm sort of playing a bit fast and loose with words when I say that, and there are all sorts of epistemological questions that can arise from making a statement like that. But I'm going to kind of try and justify it over the next few slides. Now, this is a sort of map that I think most people are familiar with. It's not particularly accurate. It was just the sort of easiest one I actually found on the web for this particular talk, and it shows the most important things. It suggests, firstly, that Homo sapiens evolved in central southern Africa. And we're pretty sure of that. As I say, we have those jawbones in Morocco, and we're not absolutely certain how old we are. But we know that Homo sapiens have been around in Africa for around 200,000 years. We also know that there were other hominid species scattered around the planet. We know, for example, in Europe, it was full of Neanderthals. We all have some Neanderthal genetics in us now, which accounts for, we think, things like our blonde hair and our propensity to sunburn, if you do have that. What we also know, and again, this is from unwrapping genomes in particular, what we also know is that about 150,000 years ago, there was a split in the human family. And there was one group that stayed in central southern Africa. And they are referred to genetically by geneticists and by linguists as the Khoisan. Those are the ancestors of people like the Bushmen that I worked with, and they remained put in southern Africa from about 150,000 years ago. The other group began to spread northwards. Another group was evidently a lot more restless. They shifted up northwards through the African continent over a period of about 50,000 years, broke out around 100,000 years ago into the Arabian Peninsula, and then rapidly moved down the coast, presumably becoming maritime people, eventually colonizing the Australias and Southeast Asia, and then very bizarrely moving into Europe only around 40,000 years ago. There's a sense that actually parts of the Iberian Peninsula were actually only colonized by Homo sapiens probably around 20,000 years ago. So what you had while this group was sort of moving northwards and basically becoming the basis of the rest of the world, pretty much all of us, you had that one group staying in southern Africa. So what you have in terms of them being, when I say about being a successful and sustainable population, part of it is by suggesting that they were geographically stable. They stayed in one spot. Now, there's more to this idea of being successful than simple geographic stability. You know, I can't make that argument simply that they weren't there. Now, this is a confusing genetics graph, and you know, my geneticist colleagues are always presenting me things like this, and I actually, frankly, haven't a clue what they're about. But this one I can roughly give you a sort of rough idea about what it should tell you. What this does is, on that map, you've got the sort of convergent line of Homo sapiens, and that goes back into a million years. It's a logarithmic scale at the bottom. But you've got, at about 150,000 years ago, you've got that process of the split. So that's roughly this bit over here, just over there, where the lines begin to diverge. And they've basically broken it up into four effectively genetic communities, four fairly distinctive genetic communities. You've got the Khoisan, who were the people who stayed in southern Africa. You've then got the Yoruba, which was a group that ended up going north and effectively colonizing most of West Africa and central northern Africa. And they kind of stayed put there and eventually evolved into sort of the Bantu populations that would later come down. And then, of course, you had the European groups and the Asian groups that moved out and progressively colonized the rest of the planet. Now, what this graph shows us is that these lines effectively represent population levels. And this graph shows us that between 30 and 120,000 years ago, every single one of these population groups experienced a significant dip in numbers. And this is because there was a period of fairly intense climate change. You had the ends of the Ice Age, you had really quite difficult circumstances. But what's most interesting about this is that of all these groups that experienced this dip, the group that experienced it least was the Khoisan. And the argument is that certainly when we look at genome diversity studies, so in other words, the sort of rates of mutation, Khoisan didn't suffer the same kind of catastrophic genetic bottlenecks that other communities had. And these genetic bottlenecks come about through starvation events, famines, wars, great catastrophes, diseases, plagues, and so on. The Khoisan population actually remained pretty much within statistically meaningful levels close to its peak, whereas everybody else dropped off particularly harshly, in particular the European and the Asian populations. And we think it's got a lot to do with climate change because Africa's climate was a lot more stable and a lot more resistant to these kind of big changes to what happened in these further northern areas. But what we can say is that probably up until around 20,000 years ago, the Khoisan, of which, you know, and I'll be clear, there are only 100,000 San people left alive today, people who identify themselves as San. So this tiny group, up 20,000 years ago, was the most populous group on the planet. And in fact, in terms of total population levels, was almost exceeded everybody else. So all the other groups combined were pretty much the same number of people as the Khoisan. So they were successful in that respect. They didn't have these genetic bottlenecks. They didn't have these terrible disasters. There was another way in which this group was particularly successful. And again, these graphs are not particularly accurate, but again, this is where it becomes important in terms of understanding this concept of sustainability. This is a graph indicating megafaunal extinctions. Now, what we know with human history is that pretty much whenever Homo sapiens showed up in a new area, you ended up having these megafaunal extinctions. These are the cave bears, the mammoths, and the saber-toothed cats, and so on. And so each of these graphs represents a different country. And you're looking at, in Africa, you have the emergence of Homo sapiens, and that arrow is wrong. We now know it's happened a lot earlier than that. And there was a small dip. There was a loss of about 10% of the total megafaunal species. Everywhere else, you had pretty catastrophic declines in megafaunal species coincident with the arrival of Homo sapiens. I don't think it was as a result of Homo sapiens going out and hunting mammoths and being super clever and super brilliant. I think it was more as a result of the fact that they entered an ecosystem as a kind of complex top predator and had cascading effects. You know, when I talk to, for example, Bushman hunters about whether they hunted elephants, they think the whole idea just sounds ridiculous. Elephants are too big to eat, they're bloody dangerous, and you're likely to get killed when you hunt them. You know, so why would you bother? So I think things like the extinctions of the mammoths and the disappearance of the saber-toothed cats, I mean, Bushmen, for example, lived very comfortably and had a great understanding with lions. I think those are to do with indirect impacts. You know, possibly, you know, it could be humans harvesting a particular set of crops, which then sets a cascading impact off. But we do have this extraordinary declines everywhere but Africa. And so again, we have this kind of strange sustainability. We have these groups of people who've been there for a very long time. So I mean, interesting, the one place where the humans have been for by far the longest time is the only place that doesn't have these megafaunal extinctions, certainly on the scale of everywhere else. Now, I'm going to try and talk through some of the reasons for it and begin to bring this sort of back into the tech fold. Now, the area we're talking about, and I've done this map in inverted because it actually shows up better on a screen. Part of the reason that you ended up with these geographically stable populations in southern Africa was just a quirk of geology. So in the middle of southern Africa, that's sort of those dotty leopard-like bits over there, is the Kalahari Basin. And the Kalahari Basin is basically a volcanic craton. It's a piece of really geologically stable land, and it's flat. And what you had was you had many rivers flowed into it, but because it was flat, no rivers flowed out of it. So you had rivers from North Africa, the Zambezi, the Kavango, and a whole series of other rivers forming various mega lakes and all sorts of things there, and depositing tons and tons of sand that they'd sort of picked up in the mountains in the north. Anyway, what it did, because it was geologically stable, it wasn't subject to these kind of geological events that would have, again, caused population bottlenecks. But at the same time, the geologic stability and its effective lie within the tropics meant that there was actually a relative degree of climatic stability, certainly compared to Europe when you ended up with the end of the sort of the glacial ice age and the glacials periods around 12,000 years ago. They had much more catastrophic impacts in Europe. In sub-Saharan Africa, the impacts were relatively limited. And again, this is also reflected in terms of how various different Bushman communities, the Khoisan communities, are distributed. Now, this is just a rough map showing the Khoisan language groups that we know about. And what's interesting about this is not who the particular individuals are. The groups that I've worked with mostly are the ones in the north, and Khankrai and Junwa, just by the picture of the big eland at the top. But what's most interesting about this particular group is we know from linguistic studies and the context studies that the Khoisan spread over much of southern Africa, and we don't know what happened in the east because by the time we actually started paying attention to it and showing interest in it, the populations in Zimbabwe and Zambia and elsewhere had effectively been wiped out or assimilated into populations of, again, from that sort of what you call that Yoruba group coming back and recolonizing a large proportion of southern Africa. But what's interesting about the language groups is that even though the languages are all very similar, and they sound absolutely similar to us from an outside ear because they're all based on the same sort of set of phonemic principles, which is a much larger alphabet than we have, and the use and frequent use of clicks. Nevertheless, Khoisan languages are incredibly distinct and diverse. Even today, amongst the tiny population of Khoisan that are left, you've got 3 distinct language communities that are completely mutually unintelligible. And there's a sort of faint hint of a 4th language community, but there's only one speaker left in southern Africa, a language community called Ngu. Now, what's particularly interesting about these language communities is it suggests actually that these groups separated and dispersed a really long time ago. And this has again been shown to us by genetics to be true. So what you have is the difference where it says Naro and Kho over there, the exclamation mark XOO. Just below them, which actually aren't on the map, are the Ngu. And in terms of genetic distance, the genetic distance between that group, the Naro, and a group that lived only 100 kilometers south of them, so 70 miles, I'm not so good at converting to miles, 70 miles. The genetic distance between them was 30,000 years. There'd been no genetic movement between these groups for a period of 30,000 years. So that kind of restlessness which afflicted the other branch of humanity that was colonizing and spreading everywhere, these groups remained astonishingly stable within space. Not only were they stable in southern Africa, but they were stable in small parts of southern Africa. Why this is also important is because when we start talking about technology, it starts to enable us to actually put dates on some of this technology. And this idea that certain technologies and ways of living and ways of interacting with technology and their environment had actually been around for a very long time. And to do this, what I want to do is just quickly give you, to sort of start getting onto that, I want to give you a quick overview of what constituted these, I suppose, primitively affluent societies. I'm going to talk very quickly about this idea of egalitarianism. And it's common amongst all hunter-gatherer societies that live in warm environments. It's more complicated when we start getting into colder environments and people stored food. But what you had was you had fiercely egalitarian societies where effectively there were no formalized leadership roles, no institutions of power, and in which everything was regulated by on a highly individual basis, and in which effectively the egalitarianism was a product of lots of individuals acting explicitly in their own self-interest. And it was most powerfully reflected. I mean, the reason I use this particular photo is it was most powerfully reflected in an institution called Insulting the Meat, which is what this lady is doing over here. I think she's doing really well. You can see the scorn in her voice and her expression. And what Insulting the Meat involved was like when a good hunter went and killed a large animal, and people loved meat. Meat is by far the most important food in Junetma society, all those hunter-gatherer societies. Meat is what you live for. And when I travel if I've got Junetma kids traveling with me or something, and we go into a supermarket at one of the local towns, it's not the sweet counter everybody goes for, it's the cold meat section. And they're shoving it in there. Anyway, the whole idea of insulting the meat is that when a hunter kills a big animal, say a giraffe, which brings with it obviously a great deal of prestige, a great deal of food, and a scarce resource that needs to be distributed. When that hunter shows up back at the village and says, I've killed this giraffe, it's over there, I can feed everybody for ages, instead of being praised, he's mocked. People will be like, oh, you call that a giraffe? That's the scrawniest thing I've ever seen. Oh, meat stinks. Oh, and it's not even enough to feed my mother-in-law. So it's this process of insulting, and it's endless insults. Even while people are filling their bellies, they're insulting the guy. And the same thing happens to pretty much anybody who has a windfall, which gives them some kind of material wealth, or to anybody who actually gets a bit boasty and big for their boots. They're mercilessly and relentlessly knocked down. So it's like this idea of tearing down hierarchies. And how this worked was it maintained this egalitarianism, which created very strong, effective social units. And at the same time, it encouraged a society which was based very strongly on sharing of resources. I think I might have a sharing resources-y slide. No, I don't. But within this idea of sharing resources being shared and not having, effectively they took away, it removed any motivation to accumulate resources or power. And the minute anybody tried to accumulate resources or power, they got torn down. And so what it did was it created a society in which people didn't bother over-exploiting. There was no point in gathering more food than you could possibly need because it couldn't be translated into social capital. In fact, if you gathered more than you need, there were all sorts of prohibitions about excessive use of resources. Or if you killed more than you need, the idea of killing more meat than you could possibly eat was viewed as utterly offensive, and people would be hammered for it. So all these things were effectively, the idea of over-exploitation of the environment was actively disincentivized. And obviously this was part of the sequence of events and part of the series of processes that enabled this group to, again, become so successful, so enduring, and so sustainable. The second important part of this idea of the original affluent society is, and again, this happens to different degrees amongst all hunter-gatherer societies, people spoke about their environments as provident. They had an unyielding confidence in the providence of their environment and in their abilities to be able to exploit that providence. Now, when I talk about a provident environment, Zhangwasi, for example, are able to identify and make use of over 150 different plant species, which is fairly extraordinary because I struggle to identify more than 5 plant species in the Kalahari. Everything looks the same to me after years still. And of those plant species, they use different parts. They can use the bulbs, the tubers, the fruits, the flowers, the nuts, all in different ways. And the gum. I mean, actually dried gum from a tree, I mean, people jokingly call it sweeties. And you actually, as you walk in the bush, you often pick gum from acacias and you chew it away. But they had this sort of absolute sense that you didn't need to harvest more than you could, because at any point, with a couple of hours' effort, you could get more food whenever you needed it. So in a sense, it was a bit like living in an urban environment, sort of, and knowing that actually, even if I don't have a full cupboard full of stock, full of stuff, I can always pop down to the 7-Eleven and get what I need when I'm hungry, or I can go and get a takeaway. There was very much this sort of sense of the environment in that sense. So they had what was called, in an anthropological sense, immediate return economy. Every piece of economic activity for food procurement that they did was based on generating immediate returns. It was to meet immediate needs. I am hungry now, therefore I will go and gather food. We need meat, therefore we will go and hunt. So it was like this sort of vast convenience store. Of course, being able to do that requires a lot more than simply, it's a bit harder than being able to go to a 7-Eleven. And this is where the question of, and the relationship with technology goes in. I managed to bring one piece of technology on the plane. I wanted to bring my poison arrows, but I was a bit worried about immigration, and I know there are all sorts of new laws coming through from the States. Every week we get a new instruction about who can come, what they can bring, and so on. So I ended up just bringing this old stick, and I was a bit worried about that as well. Now, gathering foods, plants, despite the fact that the Kalahari is a desert and looks like a tough place and it looks like there's no food at all, actually for Zhangwasi, and indeed pretty much all the other Bushman peoples that we know about, gathered foods comprised more than 50% of their total dietary intake, closer to probably 60. So meat was the other 40%. With other hunting and gathering peoples, in particular peoples who lived in areas where there were fish stocks that could be exploited, it was a much higher proportion of meat in their diets than gathered foods. And this particular picture is actually a picture of a gathering bag. It's foods we collected on a short 2-hour walk behind somebody's hut, and actually a really quite denuded and overgrazed area. This was after a good rainy season, and there's those big greeny things in the middle are sort of marama beans, which are absolutely delicious. You can't peel them open, and they've got like a big sort of bean thing inside, and you roast them on the fire, and they produce this Moorish, nutty, really yummy thing. This poor fellow over here, trying to make his escape, is a cousin of the Mopani worm. Funny enough, when we ate our way through that bag, the next morning, that poor little worm was still kind of there. I think it was sort of gathered more for show. Nobody seemed to have a real appetite. But that was really a couple of hours' work. Now, to gather that kind of food requires two things. It requires skill and knowledge of the environment. And if you look at things like these items, with this, I mean, actually it worked rather well, but this little stalk, I mean, this is a very small thing, and it pokes out of the ground. All that signifies that that little brachystemia, which is a potato, is that little bit stem poking out the ground there. And there's a different one. This one's called hairs on the stomach, like a grouse. I don't really know what the... But identifying these things takes an enormous amount of skill. And I actually find I wander through the bush, and I just cannot see them. So people there, they see them, and they identify them. There's also tama melons in that bag and various other things. Now, to be able to exploit these resources, once you have the skills to identify them, requires tools, technology. And this is the most useful thing that you can possibly have in the Kalahari Desert. And it is arguably one of the oldest tools around. We know, for example, of primates using sticks in a shape or form, not as good as this one. We also know that around 400,000 years, 300,000 years ago, my apologies, in Schöningen in Germany, we found sticks fairly similar to this. And we know Homo sapiens weren't there yet, so it's very probable that Neanderthals or other hominids were actually using sticks and sharpening them and making them. What the point about this particular stick is, though, is its antiquity. The fact is that this particular model of stick, this particular way of doing it, and this one is made out of wood called greware, which is very, very hard. It's incredibly light. And this particular stick is about 30 years old. I picked it up on my first ever trip to the Kalahari. And it's got a slightly sharpened end. It's light, it's hard, and there is no better implement for digging in the hard sands of the Kalahari than this. A regular spade is no use whatsoever. It's far too heavy to pack up. But to actually dig out something 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters under the soil, maybe a little bit more, this stick is the most ideal thing you can use. More than this stick, you can knock fruits out of the tree. You can pick off mopani worms off high branches. You can clobber snakes that get in your way. When you walk through the bush, there are thorns everywhere. You get absolutely shredded. But actually, when you see people do it, they sort of glide through using this kind of stick, pushing the thorns aside. It's an unbelievably practical piece of kit. And likewise, if you happen to run across a porcupine or something that's nice to eat, actually, it's hard enough and strong enough that you can give it a good crack on the head, and there you have your supper. And porcupine meat is regarded as the tastiest of all fats, I'm told. Of course, I've never eaten it. Anyway, so you have this extraordinary piece of kit. Now, this is a simple piece of technology, but the point is that this hasn't been elaborated on because it was fit for purpose. And in the society that endured for so long, and we know that this particular implement was probably used right from the outset, possibly 150, 200,000 years ago, and the only elaborations were probably the improvements in carving. We know that in communities of San people that lived further south from there, in areas effectively different geological areas, the mountainous areas around the Cape, that they improvised, they added donut weights onto the digging stick, which would enable them to get through harder, rockier ground. But that was really the only additional improvisation on it. So we have this great piece of kit, this great piece of tech, which represents a philosophy of usefulness. Now, the second big part of the equation in terms of primitive affluence, or the original affluent society, was, of course, hunting. That other 40% of their diet. And what is particularly interesting, and again, from a technology point of view, is the hunting technologies that were used. Now, we know, for example, that among European populations and Asian populations, the use of bows and arrows is maximum around 15 to 20,000 years ago. And again, we're not even sure it's that old. What we now have in southern Africa is evidence of bow and arrow technology being used probably as long ago as 80 or 90,000 years ago. We have pretty firm evidence, archaeological evidence, of people making sophisticated bows and arrows of 71,000 years ago, I beg your pardon. But that's the only evidence we can find. And what we also know is from looking at archaeological sites in southern Africa and combining it with the genetic material, we know that actually these technologies were really quite widespread, which again suggests real antiquity. And the nature of hunter-gatherer material culture, things like this, is that they're all pretty much biodegradable and they're hard to find and there were small populations. And there's one particular find at this place, Pinnacle Point, in South Africa, which is now actually, it's a sort of very well-to-do golf club with people in chinos driving around in silly hats and hitting balls all over the place. And it's perched on top of a series of cliffs. And while they're sort of clacking their balls around and having a great old time with their very expensive golf clubs and sending these objects hurtling over the edge, they're unaware of the fact generally that actually 70,000 years ago, people were probably also working with projectiles, but they were focused on making bows and arrows. And they were doing so in a very complicated way. And you've got to remember, this is long before anybody thought humans were engaged in complex tool-making behavior, very complex tool-making. And what they did is they found in the caves at Pinnacle Point below the golf course a series of microliths, very small, basically points napped from a rock. And a kind of the rock that they were napped from is called silkrete. It's a silicon-based thing. And I was desperately trying to come up with sort of the original Silicon Valley jokes and things to talk about. Anyway, what they did at Pinnacle Point was they made these incredibly complicated bows and arrows based on these little pieces of silkreed, and making silkreed arrowheads is a complicated business because it requires that they heat it to a very specific temperature before they can be knapped. It requires that they're then mounted very carefully into a bow, and so on. And so they become quite sophisticated pieces of kit. Silkreed as well, we also know it wasn't an accidental find because the nearest silkreed resource is probably 5 or 10 kilometers away from the actual caves. So we know that this use of this particular technology is very old indeed. And what I've done is I've shown up a picture. It's what I would have liked to have brought along with me, and sort of you can actually have quite a lot of fun because you take the arrowheads off, and it's always good to shoot one into an audience. I've been able to clear my lectures out quite quickly at Cambridge. But what I wanted to do was just show you how elegant these pieces of kit are, and in particular, the arrows. Now, this is very old technology, and I think all that's happened, there's a narrative of just successive elaboration because it was fit for purpose. It worked. Their society worked and worked for a very long time. And the beauty of this particular piece of kit is that the arrow and the bow are incredibly small. So when you had European bows and arrows being developed and Asian bows and arrows, the emphasis was always on power. It was always on getting the maximum draw weight so that you could kill an animal by impact and power. These were very light pieces of kit. The arrow shaft is made from a grass reed, a hollow grass reed. It is super light. You can carry it with one finger. In it is a detachable secondary shaft onto which the arrowhead is placed. And these arrowheads would have traditionally been made by stone or by bone. These ones have been made from fence wire. Hunter-gatherers are great adapters and users. So when the farmers came in and started building these bloody great ranches, they started using the fence wire for making arrowheads. It was much practical, it was easy, so it was adapted. The arrows are designed that they're so light that what they do is they can shoot them into an animal, and effectively there's one thing that made them effective. The thing that made them most effective was the fact that they used a form of poison. And that poison, again, is also an index of great adaptability and use. And this is to prove that I can use technology. I actually photoshopped that flower on my own into the picture. Now, this is a guy holding up a Adenium multiflorum. It's a plant. He's a Highcombe bushman in the Tosha area of Namibia. And the poison that they used was basically made from the sap of the roots of that plant. And that's a kind of very standard poison practice where we know people have used poisons in hunting. And it produces an effective poison. But it's not nearly as miraculous as the poison used by the Zhungwasi. And the Zhungwasi used this little beetle, this ladybug-like thing called the Dymphidia simplex. And what it does is it lays its grubs on a plant called the Commiphora, which is probably better known to you as the myrrh. I mean, this is what they brought gifts for the wise men dragged in with their gifts. Now, I don't know if the wise men were dragging gifts of the Dymphidia, because what the Dymphidia does is it lays its eggs on the leaves of the African myrrh, and it then covers them in shit, because that's basically what they do. It sort of forms a protective layer around it, and then they drop off the tree and into the ground just below, and they kind of wiggle their way into the ground, and then they sit there and they can gestate over a period of years. It produces a poison of such phenomenal power that effectively all a bushman hunter needs to do is scratch an animal with an arrow, break the skin very gently, and that's why using these small unfletched arrows work. They were fit for purpose. There was no need to translate it into some kind of powerful object. And as a result of it, when it was combined with their skills as a hunter, and being a good hunter required incredible tracking ability, the ability to be able to read through the land, to be able to imagine animals into the landscape. When it was combined with those skills, it became an incredibly effective tool. So hunting became relatively easy. And what you had, again, was you didn't have these endless successive elaborations and innovations based on a thing. You had an old piece of technology that was successively refined, and when a new piece of kit, like a fence wire, came in, it was adapted and brought in to improve an old technology rather than reinvent it, because it was all fit for purpose. Now, you'd ask yourself, I've painted this sort of image of primitive affluence, why does it end? Well, it ends really because of agriculture. And talking about the roots of agriculture is an entirely different lecture. In the case of the Kalahari and the Kalahari peoples, it ended because effectively people worked out how to get water in the desert. And that meant farmers piled in. And while Jinkwasi had been pretty good at keeping people out of their desert lands before then, when it came to white farmers with their horses and their ranches and their guns and their borehole drills, which they could drill deep under the Kalahari sand, it resulted in them being able to set up farms, and they effectively took most of the land. There's only one small patch of land where Jinkwasi are still able to hunt and gather freely as they did in the past. And the result of it was that by around 1990, so this process began about 60 years ago when the farmers started coming in and colonizing, they were desperate to have farm labor to make their farms work. And so they effectively imprisoned Jinkwasi on their farms. And they held the kids hostage to make their parents work. And they sent out labor recovery missions where they'd actually go on raids on horseback and shoot people and then bring them back. And they held them in sort of virtual slavery because farming in the Kalahari was damn hard. But by 1990, when Namibia achieved its independence, technology had improved a great deal. Farmers had these big machines and tractors, and in much the same way that farms over here and certainly in Europe actually are very labor unintensive. They'd become capital intensive, machine intensive. So suddenly Bushman labor became superfluous. And what happened was that when the new independence government came in, farmers worried that they'd be expected to pay their laborers properly, look after them properly, house them properly, and so they just chased them off their land. So in a sense, you ended up with the strange story of this group, the original affluent society, being forced into a labor-based economy and then being made redundant by technological advances. So in other words, this brings us right back to that loop of that initial question about the impact of automation and technological advancement. And what I'm going to really end with is this thing. This was a cover of the New Yorker, I think last week or the week before, reflecting this sort of prevailing view about the dangers of technology in terms of, well, the dangers of automation in terms of what it does with people with respect to work. Now, in terms of the discussions that we've had in it, there have been endless recent reports. There's been the World Economic Forum has produced a report. McKinsey recently produced a report. It's all the discussion has basically been on what is it going to do to our relationship with work? What are we going to do for people who are nudged out of the workplace by robots and machines? And you end up with this kind of slightly miserable image that you have in the New Yorker. And the proposals have all basically been towing the sort of established paradigm of work. So you have, for example, McKinsey, who optimistically say, well, this robotization is actually going to add 1.4% to productivity, so we can keep growth going. And they also said, well, traditionally, as you know, we found that actually when you have these technological innovations and revolutions, actually they end up creating lots more jobs for people who need to fix the stuff when it breaks. So there was that kind of optimistic view. Then you've had people like Bill Gates who come in with a more interesting proposition of suggesting that actually what they should do is maybe tax machines as if they were human beings, these robots that are doing work. I mean, it raises some interesting questions, and it raises interesting questions in terms of effectively capital growth, because I think there's an extraordinary resurgence in asset value growth, in particular in tech, just as much as there is in land. But again, I don't think that's the kind of solution that we need to it. What I'd like to think is that we live in an era where basically these old solutions do not work. We're effectively rehearsing and rehashing tired ideas. Our political narratives tend to focus on really established ideas of it's either socialism or capitalism, it's either this kind of neoliberalism or it's not this neoliberalism. What I think we are is we're sitting on a planet with 7.5 billion people. There have never been 7.5 billion people before. We're sitting with unprecedented ecological and environmental challenges. And it's extraordinary to me, in the 25 years that I've worked in Namibia, I don't think there is a wild place left in Namibia. Every place where I work, which 25 years ago actually had this sort of sense of freedom and wildness, is now places where the elephants roam are managed properties, in a sense. So places where the elephants go by the grace not of God, as it was the case 25 years and longer ago, but by the grace of man. They are protected by policy and in various forms. And I think in terms of rising up and meeting these challenges, I think we have to break out of this sort of cycle of looking towards the recent past and looking at these institutions and ways of doing things that we inherited from the agricultural revolution. And I think there's tremendous value in actually taking a step back and maybe saying, what are the principles? What are the areas of focus that enabled the Khoisan in particular and other hunter-gatherer societies as well to become so successful and enduring, and maybe begin to use those as a way to reimagine our relationship with our future and possibly reimagine how we're going to shape our future. And I believe that this question of automation and robotization is a kind of obvious starting point in which to do it. And instead of looking at automation as a great challenge to what the hell are we going to do to find people work to do, maybe we should look at it as an opportunity to entirely reimagine our relationship with the workplace and then cascade on from that to reimagine the economics that surround our particular obsession with the workplace. And I think with that, I should bring it to an end. Thank you very much.
So we're going to invite questions from the audience now, and I just want to point out that there's some mics here and mics here, so if you have questions for James, just come on up by the mics, and he'll take questions as you have them.
Test? Okay. So, I heard at the beginning of your lecture that you mentioned the people that you spoke of were in the habit of mocking people with material wealth. I find that practice very very appealing. Would you suggest that that would be a productive way to engage in this future?
Actually, it's an interesting way of you put it. I mean, I think people are doing that. I think bizarrely, and it's another area that when I was actually putting this lecture and thinking through this lecture together, I was thinking about the way people behave with the anonymity of the web, and even some people not with so much the anonymity of the web, the ease with which we resort to insults when we get in an argument on a message board or on Facebook or something. And in many ways, it sort of reflects to me that kind of democratizing impulse. I think that the evidence of hunter-gatherer societies, and there's a whole other paper I've got on this, is I think actually the role of looking at insults, and in particular the way selfish motives are expressed in hunter-gatherers, I think we are instinctively egalitarian. And I think this is why we actually get tremendous pleasure when we see the mighty topple, as much as we like it when we see people fall from a great height. In England, we have an expression about tall poppies being knocked down. Don't be a tall poppy, because the tall poppy is the one that gets hit by the boy with a stick, so that the poppy field is level. So we all have this desire to do leveling behaviors, and I think, yes, I think you should tell insults. I think anybody who gets too big for their boots should be held insults. In fact, you should mock me for this lecture.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Oh no, you should.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, what would late night TV be without insults?
Yeah.
What is the equivalent of like Khoisan kindergarten? I mean, we've been talking about how they're masters of the environment. Now, how is that knowledge imparted to the children?
Well, in terms of, again, there was actually tons of really interesting work done by what was called the Harvard Kalahari Research Group, looking at early childhood development and processes around it. Now, again, I haven't talked a great deal about it, but in this fiercely egalitarian, non-hierarchical society, that's reflected in how children are dealt with. So in terms of education, there's no formal didactic education whatsoever. Children are expected to find things out on their own. But at the same time, there's incredible levels of affection and mutual looking after through all age levels. So children typically play in mixed age groups. There's none of this kind of age group hierarchy thing that, again, is very prominent in agricultural societies. We actually end up with age cohorts and initiation groups. Khoisan games, or Zhenhua games, traditionally were, one, non-competitive. So even when boys were like shooting arrows, it was not done in a particularly competitive way. They were also multi-age group, and they generally were focused on consensual things. So you ended up with a very different cycle of early childhood development. And again, really interestingly, I mean, some of the papers that were done, and we can't really do it anymore because people are no longer autonomously hunting and gathering. But a woman called Patricia Draper did some really good work on this in the early 1970s. And remarkably enough, discovered that actually Zhenhua children learned to walk much younger than their European counterparts. They learn to talk much younger than their European counterparts. And we're able to socially engage and do functional things much earlier than their European counterparts. So there's plenty to be looked at there. I have to say it's not an area I'm massively expert in, but again, that's a broader cultural thing manifested in terms of how people raised kids. And there was, of course, I should add, no corporal punishment. And there is a problem, is that now, Bushman kids need school. They need to get on in this society. Otherwise, they remain massively marginalized. But schooling is terrible for them. They cannot cope with the rigors of this age group education because culturally they struggle. And their parents, who don't believe in forcing anything on their children, struggle to force their children to stay at school. So we're dealing now, even though actually the schools and system in Namibia, really by African standards, is actually pretty good. You're dealing with, basically with Zhumwa kids, you're looking at around a 98% dropout rate by year 3. So it's a significant problem. There are a couple of there are a couple of schools now that they've tried to sort of develop and adapt. And there are also issues around mother tongue education. So Bushman languages are not viewed as real languages by governments. And so they're forced to learn in Setswana, English, and other languages, which of course is very difficult. I mean, not learning in your mother tongue, basically, it's a massive disadvantage.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. So I thought your talk was terrible.
Thank you very
and
much.
I'm very glad that I had to suffer through it. I had so many questions. So the picture, for example, that you showed of large mammal die-offs, I thought there was some large connections to climate changes in some of those pictures, and not so much in others. And in general, I'm curious about, you highlighted the importance of geography into this kind of very stable, long-lived society. And so I was curious if more so about some of the other hunter-gatherer societies you mentioned that didn't have that same kind of stability, and if you think we should look at some of those societies also.
Well, I certainly think we should look at those societies also, but I think what they illustrate is a sort of different set of principles. So when we take, for example, I have a lot of colleagues who work with northern nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, so Yukagir in Siberia, and of course Inuit and so on in this part of the world. And I think, again, they're much more recent arrivals into the areas that they lived in because it required lots more technology, in a sense, clothing and so on, to actually be able to cope with those particular sets of climate. And I think in terms of beginning to understand the roots of the agricultural revolution, storage-based economies, I think we see those roots in a lot of these northern hunter-gatherer societies, in particular ones, for example, that exploited things like seasonal salmon runs, which makes a sort of huge difference to it. Suddenly storage becomes a thing, which is why, for example, you have things famous, the anthropology first-year staple of the potlatch ceremony. You'd never have anything like that with the Bushmen. It just wouldn't work. It would be the minute somebody tried giving out things in exchange for prestige, they'd have the shit ripped out of them immediately. Please forgive my language. It's my uncle's fault. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be taken from them, but I think they're slightly different lessons. There are, of course, other hunter-gatherer populations, like the Baka and Aka, they're traditionally called pygmies in the rainforests, so very similar ways of organizing and actually engaging with their world. And in fact, they tend to see their environment in very, very similar terms. They animate their environment more than the Zhungwasi do. And likewise with some South American hunters, and actually people who are sort of on the grade of limited agriculture, 1 or 2 crops. And there's definitely a spectrum and a scale. So I think there's plenty more work to be done, and that's why I'm kind of careful about talking very specifically about this particular group that I know about. And I also know a little bit about, say, groups like the Hadza in East Africa and so on. But actually, once we move beyond that, I think the questions begin to change very differently. But I think, yes, they'll all be massively illustrative. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.
Yes. I'm curious, your idea that the stick hasn't changed in usage or the form in such a long time, and probably the technology change in golf clubs in the last 20 years has been massive, right? And we just have technology change at an accelerating rate. And do you have any thoughts on why, our technology changes so fast? Is it it doesn't actually meet the function, or we're constantly trying to improve it, or are there other economic reasons, or does the technology just need more technology? And why has our rate of technology changed so much faster than this stick that meets its function and hasn't changed in such a long time?
Well, I think there are lots of different ways you can look at that and answer that question. I think obviously some of it is to do with just simply the amount of brains and energy that are applied to a problem. But I also think that there's this, there's this sort of restlessness. I think it's a sort of illustrative of a more broad cultural issue, in particular in the West. And it's, again, one of our inheritances from needing to solve the problems of dependency on agriculture. Our early agriculturalists had a really tough time. So I think this idea of sort of constant revolution in terms of technology, constant innovation, is actually the sort of sense that somehow we're continuously fixated on a future. We aspire to get things right consistently. So we're never satisfied with what we have now. And this is the sort of basis of this idea of having few wants easily met. Jinkwasi were basically satisfied with what they had. They had certain things that they needed to meet. And if they could meet those, why was there need to, this whole idea of necessity as the mother of invention? I think now we're caught up in this kind of productive technological loop that actually to make a living on this earth, you've got to be original, you've got to do something new. If I wrote a book which repeated, actually it kind of does repeat stuff other people have said. So maybe I'm not absolutely right, but there's this whole sort of emphasis on being original and new. And I think it's very much a cultural phenomenon. And again, I think it's reflected more broadly in concepts like our obsession with growth. This idea that somehow you have to have continuous growth. I mean, why can we not have renewal? Why is there not this space for this? So I think it's a sort of cultural thing that, there's a real pressure on us to have this idea of innovation, novelty, and that's how we make it go. How do you make a million? You come up with the next great new web platform. Is it something that we need? No, it's something that only people become dependent on once they have it. We were all fine without mobile phones, but now none of us can live without mobile phones. Everybody was fine before Facebook was invented and actually had lots of friends and stuff. Now, lots of people can't manage without it. So in a sense, technology suddenly creates new needs in us. And there's this whole idea of novelty feeding the engine of growth, effectively. And I think that's a cultural thing. And I think what this stuff tells us is actually, historically, we're not naturally preordained to be obsessed with growth. It's a particular cultural phenomenon. And I think there's a very distinctive history. It's a whole other lecture, but actually to look at the roots of this, and I write about it quite a lot in the book, but I think all the roots of these kinds of behavior lie in the early agricultural revolution, which was when we had the birth of the economic problem and the problem of scarcity and the need to manage long-term risk. People started thinking about the future and holding themselves hostage to the aspiration of actually being liberated from the economic problem by wealth. So I think there's a whole nexus of intersecting ideas there. Thanks.
So I guess my meta question relates to how does culture change for good or worse? And the thing that prompted this was your comments about anonymity and the comments that people make when they're anonymous being supportive of the notion that we're all very egalitarian. And my observation is that anonymity usually brings out the worst of people in terms of, vandalism and cruelty and so on. So is that a cultural thing that is not innate in our egalitarian roots, or how would you think about that? And what do we do about these cultural trends that are negative?
I think first thing I do is I take comfort in the fact that, we tend to sort of, this is, I think, partially a sort of woods for the trees thing. We're caught in the middle of this particular change. We're engaged in, and again, this is something which one of those other clever anthropologists who are doing digital stuff would actually be probably better able to answer. But I think we're in a space where we're actually navigating our way around. We've had a whole new realm of interaction, a space of interaction in digital spaces. And we actually haven't developed the cultural forms and manners around it yet. It's a cultural evolutionary space. And I think it's happening, and I think we're learning. I think it's still very much early days, and the problem is the whole platform keeps shifting so quickly. So I don't really know which direction it is. I prefer to be optimistic, because frankly, it's so easy to be pessimistic about everything these days. So I prefer to imagine that actually the way the tech space is changing is actually it's organically might resolve into this kind of collective democratizing force that, certainly the early social media pioneers all imagined it would be. And that maybe we're sort of singing its death knell a little bit too early by saying it's this great divider, and it's producing these kind of echo chambers, and people are behaving terribly with one another, hurling gross insults all the time. maybe it actually will become this great democratizing force in a far more profound way than we could ever imagine. And maybe some of the political ructions that we've endured over the last year and a half, which, you know, we've had Brexit and then you guys outdid us, which is great. You know, maybe these things are actually all indicative of us trying to come to grips with a new way of engaging with one another. And that culture needs to be bedded in. People have to learn manners, and manners are created through consensus. And I think that's what needs to happen. And you do actually notice that there are certain forms of formality and behavior and cultural norms that are developing within certain web communities and changing, and people are changing their behavior. So I prefer to be slightly optimistic about the way those changes may manifest. And I think maybe naturally, with our inclination towards egalitarianism, maybe we're actually just going through a sort of hiccup on a grander, more positive role. I say that anyway, just to, because normally I'm remorselessly pessimistic about everything. I don't think it goes down well on videotape.
May the force be with you in that perspective.
And also with you.
Hey, so you've shed a lot of light on sort of the communal, the sort of external facts, the geographic and historical data. I was wondering if you could share some of your experiences of living with these people, i.e., who are they, and sort of and more insight into their individual mythologies and the history of mythologies that they live with. How do they fundamentally, if at all, differ from, you know, the technology-obsessed people that we spoke about? Do they have, for instance, do they still hold the self in the same high regard that we do? Do they have an infatuation with the individual sort of view of the world that we hold so dear to our hearts? What are the stories they tell themselves to perceive the planet, and how do they go to sleep every night? Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious to know if there's a fundamental difference in who they are as human beings, and if, you know, the interplay with the structures we spoke about, how does that affect sort of the individual?
Okay, well, that's probably the longest question I've ever had to answer. I could spend all night trying to talk about this, so I'll answer it in two very simple ways. The first thing is in terms of hanging out with people like that. The wonderful thing about anthropology, and you know, one of my early lecturers talked about anthropology as this journey where the strange becomes familiar and the familiar strange, is that after a while when you live with a community like this, you kind of know that you've got it when things cease to be exotic, when you actually start, you know, being amazed at how different things are, and you start thinking, well, that guy over there, he's, you know, particularly smelly, or he's too argumentative, or people become absolutely normalized. And certainly I feel just as home in Namibia. In fact, I probably feel a little more home because it's warm, and I'm a warm-blooded creature. I don't like the cold and the wet and the dark. So I probably feel more relaxed and happy than I'm there, but I certainly don't feel any sort of social engagement. So things get normalized, and what the wonderful thing is that you sort of overcome these superficial differences, and you realize that actually all of us are very human, and we communicate and engage with one another on a very simple level. But in terms of those broad concepts you talk about, ideas like how we constitute and construct and see our individualism, or even concepts like the word happiness. You know, the word happiness doesn't exist in Junwa. It's a, you know, and the whole idea of the pursuit of happiness, which a lot of us talk about now in this particular society. So often these core things, I think, are very strongly culturally mediated, and I think they're mediated by our experience of the environment. Another thing which I didn't have time to talk tonight about is very profoundly how people feel and engage with time. You know, hunter-gatherer cultures did not experience time, I think, in the way we did. And that is why there's a much lower emphasis in terms of looking at the future, looking at the past. And I think it's because of the sense of the provident environment, this need not to plan. And it manifests in all sorts of interesting ways. But to be able to sort of get a real answer on that kind of individual side, I mean, I worked really quite hard in the book at actually doing that. So the book actually, all these discussions about time and history and the agriculture are all interspersed with very detailed sort of character sketches, which sort of highly individualize this process and how they've engaged with the kinds of changes that they've had to do, and how those changes has amplified those differences in terms of their perception and our perception of them. So yeah, it's too big a question to answer in this one go, but at the same time, they remind me constantly of our shared humanity, but there are some very big and profound differences. But hopefully you'll read the book.
Well, speaking of time, our time has fled. So we're going to draw our evening to a close, the formal part of our evening to a close. but perhaps James can stay for a little bit for some one-on-one with some folks. And the video from this evening will be online, so if you have friends who aren't here this evening who you think might be interested in these things, you can point them there in, I don't know, a couple weeks or so. I'm not quite sure how long that takes. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking James again for traveling here and sharing his ideas.
Thank you.